And so, oh, that's the recording started. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're on the record now.
Right, great. Okay, so yeah, I just want to say on behalf of Speleo Canada and IYCK, to just, a warm welcome to our guest speakers today. So we have Christine at Lohr. Do I have that pronunciation correct?
Yes. Yes.
And Hannah Horn.
Hi, guys.
Of the Ministry of Forests, Lands and Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development. And we also have with us tonight, Dr. Paul Griffiths, and he will be speaking about the BC Caves and Karst Day. And Christine and Hannah will be speaking about karst management in British Columbia. So thanks so much, guys, for coming and speaking with us. This is excellent. And I'll let you take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Ray. You guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. It's just wonderful to be able to present to all of you. I would like to start by saying, well, for a start, that I'm calling you from Victoria, British Columbia, and the traditional territory of the Lekwungen people, and very pleased and honored to be able to live and work here. And I'd also like to start by just really acknowledging Paul Griffiths and Chris Lohr, who know way more about karst than I do. I just bustle about and try and look important and try and connect people together. But those two really know their stuff. So I'm going to start to speak. Chris is going to show the presentation, and then Chris will take the last half of our presentation, and then Paul will present. So let's start with the poster and the picture in the poster, which doesn't look like a very good way to manage karst. You can see in the poster that there's some exposed epikarst. That this is actually taken from a burn site, the Kinman Fire near Port McNeill, and this is what happened when a cut block was burned. And this is really a good picture to show why we need special management for karst. So you can, those of you who know all of what's going on here, there's some catastrophic soil loss due to the soil that's completely burned by the wildfire. And this soil is mostly organic. And then the picture shows how vulnerable karst terrain is to damage from wildfire, especially after harvesting, which removed the canopy cover and would have allowed the organic layer to become dry. And you can also see slash on the site that would have contributed to the combustible materials on the ground. So that's not hopefully how we manage, how we try and get people to manage karst in BC. But I'm going to talk about what we actually have in place for karst management in BC. Chris, can you change to the next slide, please?
Okay. Can everyone see the presentation, by the way?
Yes, we can see it. I'll just note if for the speakers, for those speaking, it's great. It's if you want to, you can go into the speaker's view. But it's totally up to you and whatever you can manage with your presentation setup. But feel free to turn. I think Jerry's announcement to turn video off was just intended for the audience. But for those, you're more than
here
welcome
I
to
am.
keep
I'm
your
back.
video on.
Yeah, that's correct.
Cute.
Sorry, I should have been clearer.
Yeah,
That's okay.
yeah. Thank you. Okay,
Can you see me now?
Yeah, I can see you now, and I can see your presentation just fine.
Excellent. Thank you. So this is a beautiful karst cave near Lake Cowichan that we saw, what, Chris, 3 weeks ago?
Yeah.
And that's our boss. That's Director Matt Leroy, who couldn't resist going and having a look. And so this is just the cover slide. But just to say that forestry is a very ubiquitous land use activity across BC, and including a lot of areas that cover karst. And so most of the province's karst management framework has evolved around the forestry sector and forest practices. And most of the karst resources in BC are actually on Crown land, which comprises 95% of the province's land base. And then our ministry, the Ministry of Forest Lands, Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development, is currently the ministry most involved in karst management. And I'll talk a little bit about how we call it Flunrord. Our ministry requires sensitive karst areas to be protected and the resource values conserved. The bit of the 5% of the province that's not public land is private, and there is some karst in some areas of private land that are logged still, but under different kind of regulations. So Chris, next slide, please. So my presentation is kind of the dry presentation. I'm talking about the regulations and the legislation, but it's to provide really a framework. And so this next slide shows the two pieces of regulation. So the legislation that covers how we do forestry in BC is called the Forest and Range Practices Act. And there are a couple of regulations under that. And one of them allows the designation of a resource feature, is what it's called. And though there's a whole list in the regulation of the type of resource features that can be designated under the government actions regulation. But one of them is a surface or subsurface element of a karst system. And once, we call them GAR orders, government actions regulation. And once a GAR order for karst exists, then another another regulation kicks in under the Forest Planning and Practices regulation, which requires any person who carries out a primary forest activity to ensure that that activity does not damage or render ineffective the karst feature for which the designation occurred. Now, it can be challenging and controversial to prove damage or rendering ineffective to a karst feature, but that's what's in the regulation currently. Next slide, please.
Okay.
And currently there are 6 natural resource districts that have these GAR orders for karst. Campbell River, Chilliwack, Haida Gwaii, North Island, South Island, and Sunshine Coast. And these are all, as you can see, probably those of you in BC anyway, recognize that these are coastal areas. And within those GAR orders, there tend to be 3 karst features identified: karst caves, significant surface karst features, and important features and elements within very high or high vulnerability terrain. So again, to go back to what happens, you designate under GAR, and then once that means that you cannot damage or render ineffective a karst cave, significant surface karst feature, or important features and elements within very high or high vulnerability terrain. So next slide, please, Chris.
Okay.
Now, that's those are the designations that are very specific to karst, but there may be opportunities to co-locate other types of designations with karst and caves where they occur. So, for example, you might be designating a wildlife habitat area for I don't know, bears or goshawks or something, and there would be some karst and caves captured within that. Also, wildlife habitat features, which are very specific features related to habitats, such as dens or mineral licks or whatever, or within areas of old growth. And often when people will try and decide where to put these other designations, they'll try and get the best bang for the buck by co-locating them in areas that have as much other value as possible, which is why it's so important that we know where these karst features are. Also parks or protected areas. And it's also possible to protect karst and caves within private conservation areas, such as identified through the Land Conservancy or other more private designations. Next slide, please. Oh, and I just wanted to, can you go back to the previous slide, please, Chris? And I
Yeah.
just wanted to point out that that's Chris
Oh,
on our field trip, look with a great big grin on her face, standing above the cave that we showed you a picture of earlier with our boss Matt. Cheers. And next slide. Thank you.
okay.
So now that's the main way that forest practices have to recognize and adhere to karst, but there are other ways to bring in consideration of karst and potentially caves, other caves. For example, when Crown land authorizations occur under the Land Act for commercial or organized not-for-profit use of caves, there is an opportunity to introduce some controls, and also strategically to plan for karst and caves. There are a number of strategic land use planning processes around the province that are being jointly undertaken now with between the British Columbia government and nations, First Nations, and the whole purpose of these strategic land use planning processes to identify zoning objectives to protect values of concern, which could include karst and caves. And example of one that already exists is under the Haida Gwaii Land Use Objectives Order, where legal objectives have been established for karst and forestry. And the whole point of that is once these objectives are established and these zones are established in law, then any forestry activity must adhere to that legal order. And then another current planning process that's happening right now is forest landscape planning. And it's an opportunity that is still under discussion. It's fairly new, but again, it's government to government between BC and nations, and an opportunity to bring in a consideration of karst catchment areas. So forest landscape planning is a smaller planning unit. Next slide, please.
Okay.
And there are also non-legal guidance to, I'm sorry, I'm having a bit of technical challenge on my end. Okay, there we go. There's also non-legal guidance for how to manage karst. And it's not legislated, but it's the kind of Bible, the best management practice for how we both inventory karst with the karst inventory standards and vulnerability assessment procedures for British Columbia, and also the karst management handbook for British Columbia. As I understand it, Paul, you had a really big role in the development of these documents. And these two handbooks are complementary guidance documents. They're intended to be used in tandem, and but they're not legally enforceable because they're not established in law. We call it the KISFAP, Karst Inventory Standards and Vulnerability Assessment Procedures, sets out standard methods and procedures for conducting karst inventories and assessments at 3 spatial scales. And the Karst Management Handbook provides recommended best management practices for conducting forestry activities based on the results of the karst inventories and assessments in the KISFAP. And that includes things like road building and associated activities, timber harvesting, and post-harvest operations. And the practice guidelines in the Karst Management Handbook also address inventory data security, recreational access to sensitive karst sites or features. The Karst Management Handbook strategy for managing karst in BC is grounded in 2 basic principles. One, that not all karst features or elements need to be found or known to manage a karst system, and that subsurface karst resources are to be managed through appropriate forest practices applied on the surface. And again, this, as you are all abundantly aware, this is one of the challenges of dealing with a resource that is partly subsurface. Karst management strategy, I just mentioned, is multi-scale, and the aim is to maintain the integrity of whole karst systems while conserving number one, important surface and subsurface karst features or elements and be sensitive karst terrain. But it really employs a total karst management approach. Non-karst catchment areas that contribute water to karst downstream need to be, under this approach, delineated and appropriate management considered where needed, since the water that inputs to the system also affects the karst system. And the idea is to be implementing this approach with through adaptive management, so that what is learned from management outcomes can help reset and fine-tune karst management in a continuous improvement cycle. And after I finish speaking, you're going to hear from Chris talking about a structured monitoring program under the Forest and Range Evaluation Program to also provide continuous improvement to karst management. A third document on the right-hand side there is the Karst Cave Management Handbook for Vancouver Forest Region, and it's fairly old, right? How old is that, Chris?
1994.
1994. Yeah. And it's the guidance for completing specialized tasks of cave inventories and cave mapping. Next slide, please. So, oh, next one, please, Chris. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, yeah, sorry.
No problem. So it's an imperfect system. We are always looking for opportunities to improve how we manage caves and karst. And I'm sure Paul will be the first person to tell you that there are numerous things that we need to do to strengthen what we do. And with that, to that end, I'd really like to do a shout out to the Karst Science Advisory Group, which is a group of karstologists, acknowledging Paul Griffiths and Carol Ramsey, other karst scientists, and practitioners, on-the-ground practitioners who get together. It's internal and provides internal input to government on how we can strengthen karst management. And these are some of the things that the CASAG has put forward already. So improvements to forest practices under the Forest and Range Practices Act, things like buffers around dolines, karst streams and springs, sinking streams, and practices to better protect karst soil. So these are all things that that the CASAG, we call it. There are a lot of acronyms in the karst world, karst management world in BC, but these aren't things that are actually happening yet. They're things, the inputs that we are taking to other sections of government and saying, hey, this is really knowledgeable input on ways to strengthen and improve karst management in BC. Please consider this. So that's the one, is the improvements to forest practices, also inputs on better protection of karst old growth, and that's very current in BC right now. It's all old growth all the time. People are very concerned about old growth, and opportunities to improve management of old growth, and karst old growth is part of that. Opportunities for karst at the landscape level is part of forest landscape planning, and I mentioned that earlier. Ways to improve karst potential mapping, using LiDAR to better map karst features. More and more management units in BC have LiDAR coverage. BCTS, BC Timber Sales, has apparently just made their LiDAR available for others to use. There's some really great examples out of Alaska from karst scientists up there that have spoken to us about ways to use LiDAR to map karst features, which is very exciting. And then the karst guidance, the non-legal guidance that I mentioned earlier, is the go-to for both karst inventory and karst management, but they're getting dated now, and there's an opportunity maybe to loop back, look through it, and see is there a way to strengthen it in 2021. So that's, I think, everything, but I did want to show you a video that Paul Barrelett, who's a forester from North Island District, had sent to share. And Chris, if you can get this Running, please.
All right, so yeah, Paul Barreley sent this to us, but the credit goes to Marie Estlin for taking the video. So
Okay.
it's just a short video, so I'm going to start it now. Hopefully you'll have sound as well.
So this occurred after a number of rainy days, and there's a very strong current of water. You'll see how we're coming up to the mouth of the cave here, the karst feature. And then when the video pans to the right, you can just barely see the dry stream bed above the cave. So in this case, all the inputs to the stream are from the mouth of the cave, from underground. Just a really nice example of the hydrology of a karst system and its importance. So that's all for me. I'm going to hand it over to Chris to take it from here on FREP.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Hannah. My name is Chris Lohr, and Hannah is my manager. We work together at the Resource Planning and Assessment Branch. And I'm going to talk about the FREP karst evaluations. So after harvesting on karst terrain, we implement what's called a FREP karst evaluation to help us understand how effective forest practices have been in protecting the karst resources. But first, what is FREP? So FREP stands for the Forest and Range Evaluation Program, and its purpose is to assess the impacts of forest and range activities on the 11 FERPA resource values to determine if on-the-ground results are achieving the government's desired outcomes for these values, with karst being one of these values. Another purpose is to monitor and report on the condition of resource values, including trends and causal factors, and also to identify opportunities for continued improvement of practices, policies, and legislation. So karst is evaluated under FREP because karst is considered one of the 11 FERPA values. And that happens where there is a GAR order that has established a karst or a karst features as a resource feature. And that's, Hannah was talking about the GAR orders earlier today. So there's just 6 resource districts in British Columbia that have the GAR orders establishing components of karst as a resource feature. So for FREP, for any value that is being evaluated, there is always an evaluation question, a question that the assessment is trying to answer. And on this slide, the top question in the dark green box is the original question for karst, and it's quite broad, and I'll read it. Are current forest practices protecting and maintaining the structure, function, and ecological integrity of the surface and subsurface elements of karst systems? So how do we answer this question or measure this? Because it's difficult. The karst system is large, it's hard to define, and it's difficult to observe from the surface. And with FREP, these evaluations are meant to be repeatable, rapid, and routine. So for a FREP karst evaluation, we can only observe the surface. And so the premise of this is that surface disturbances results in impacts to the surface and subsurface. And karst is an inherently sensitive system due to its interconnectedness between surface and subsurface. And so because of this, we know that surface disturbances can cause impacts such as soil loss, loss of productivity, but that a lot of these impacts are not readily observable. They can happen slowly over time, for example, gradual soil loss, or they can take place underground. But for FREP, we can only observe the surface. So we have 3 assumptions for our karst evaluation. One, that surface karst features, and what I mean by that, we'll talk about that a bit more, but for example, that would be sinkholes or dolines, sinking streams, karst springs, cave entrances. These individual features can be used as a proxy to give us an idea of the health of the state of the karst system as a whole. And assumption number 2, we assume that if forestry related disturbances to these surface features are absent or very few, then it is more likely that the structure, function, and ecological integrity of the karst system have been maintained. And third assumption is that only recent forestry related disturbances are considered. So we're not going to try to factor in any previous natural or post-harvest disturbances. And so all of this leads to our current protocol evaluation question, which is the blue box on the bottom left. And this is more directly what we're measuring. Are current forest practices protecting and conserving surface karst features and higher vulnerability karst terrain? So this slide here is just a very high-level overview of the FREP karst evaluation. The framework of the FREP karst evaluation is as follows. So first, we randomly select a cut block to be evaluated. And these blocks will only be in those districts with the GAR orders. We get an initial list of potential cut blocks, and this is derived by a mapping exercise where we just overlap karst polygons, the karst potential, with cut blocks that are 1 to 3 years old. Then we randomly order the list. And then the goal is for each district to evaluate 6 of these cut blocks per field season. So to find the 6 blocks, the assessor goes down the list and requests the information from licensees and decides to keep or drop the block, depending if there is karst or not. Because recall, well, the original mapping exercise is kind of crude, and just because there's an intersection between a karst potential and a cut block doesn't necessarily mean that there's visible karst features on the block. So starting with the number of cut blocks at the top of the list, the assessor, who's a FLNRORD staff, will request a karst inventory, a karst field assessment, or site plan information from the licensee. And from this information, the assessor will decide whether to keep the block if it has karst or drop it if there is no karst. They'll continue down the list until they have 6 blocks. So once a block is selected, then a karst sample area is defined. So we can't necessarily evaluate the whole cut block, and we may not want to. So a karst sample area is just a continuous, uninterrupted area linked to a cut block, but it could go a little bit outside of the cut block, and this is the area identified for evaluation. It could include all of the block or just part of it, and it can go outside within 100 meters to capture features that were intentionally excluded from the harvest area. The karst sample area should be a size that can be evaluated in 1 field day. Recall, our FREP evaluations are meant to be rapid and routine, so we want to make sure we can do this in a day. The KSA, the karst sample area, should try to include both harvest and retention areas if possible. So once we have a KSA defined in the office, we then have to select a sample of features, surface karst features, from the known set of features. The known set of features are those features that were pre-identified in the assessments that were given to us by the forest licensee. So if there's a lot of features, we won't have time to evaluate them all in a day. So in this case, we randomly select a sample of features. So the sample from the known is selected randomly from the different categories of features in the karst sample area. But in the example on this slide, there's 10 features and we're going to try to sample them all. So then once we're in the field, we evaluate the surface karst features. And what we do is we note the presence and extent of disturbance indicators, which I'll talk about a little more in a bit. Next, we roll up the results for the karst sample area as a whole. And lastly, we want to score or rate how well karst was protected on the site. In other words, we want to try to answer that original question: how well did forest practices protect the karst features? Now this rating unfortunately is still under development, so I can't really describe anything to you right now at this point, but I will try to talk a little bit more about it later in the presentation, what we're trying to come up with. So in a nutshell, this is the framework of the evaluation. Okay, but a little more on surface karst features first, because really this is the crux. This is what we're focusing in on when we're doing the evaluation in the field. So, because remember, the surface karst feature is the proxy for the larger karst system. So what are surface karst features? They are simply distinguishable surface elements of a karst system. They are those features of the karst landscape that can be viewed by an observer on the ground up to the threshold of daylight in subsurface openings, e.g. a cave entrance. We don't go in a cave because that's a subsurface feature that is beyond the threshold of daylight. So here I have listed the types of surface karst features. We have cave entrances, karst springs, sinking streams, sinking watercourses, sinkholes or dolines, epikarst exposures, and other. And for other, we have a subset of a multitude of different other features. And this could be things like karst window, karst bluffs, karst ponds, grikes, karst arches, karst hums, rock shelters, etc. And then we have a couple things that's a combination of features. One is a feature complex. This is a combination of two or more features that are nested together or overlapping. So say a cave entrance at the bottom of a sinkhole. And a feature cluster is two or more surface karst features that are physically separate, but within twice times the greatest diameter of the closest neighbor. And often we'll see this with sinkholes. We'll have clusters of sinkholes. So on the slide, I got an example, bottom left, of a cave entrance sinking stream complex. The middle bottom is a cave entrance sinkhole complex. This is actually fairly common. Top right is an epikarst exposure. And those are Paul's boots there on the right, in case you didn't recognize them. And bottom right is a karst spring. So like I described earlier, surface karst features are evaluated for disturbance. So here I just want to talk a bit about that. So when we're at a feature that has been randomly selected for evaluation within the karst sample area, we look at the different types of disturbances. These are indicators in this evaluation. Indicators are measurable variables that represent the condition of the value being evaluated, in this case karst, and more specifically, the surface karst features. So in the table on the top left, we've got the 7 indicator questions, which are really 7 disturbance questions. And we ask that during the evaluation of every feature on our sample list. So were any trees removed from the karst feature? Is there any new wind throw at the feature? Has any road material or logging slash been introduced into the feature? Has any disturbance to the forest floor, mineral soil, or bedrock occurred at the feature? Has any recent burning occurred at the feature? Is there a change in natural shade at the feature? And is there a change to the understory vegetation at the karst feature? And we also collect additional information of whether there was any evidence of previous disturbance, like a first pass harvest or previous fire or wind throw. But that isn't factored into the results, the information we do collect. So this slide will just give you a better appreciation of what we evaluate at each feature. So on the top right, here's an example of a sinkhole within a harvest area. And here we're definitely noting, yes, there's been tree removal. So we would document that indicator. And we would say, yes, there has been trees removed. We would count the number of stumps. We would count the number of standing trees. We would calculate a percentage, and we would note if any non-merchantable trees were retained. In this top right example, there's probably other disturbance indicators also, like for sure shade alteration. There might also be introduction of slash. There might be a change in understory. It's hard to tell without being there. It's just a picture, but yeah. And the picture on the bottom left is another quite a bit larger sinkhole. And this one, I don't know if you can tell, but I think there's a suspected cave entrance at the bottom. But in this scenario, you can see that there's actually exposed mineral soil, and we've just dotted the outline of where that would be, because when you record that, yes, there's exposed mineral soil. We would also collect information on what the estimated percent of the entire feature was occupied by this exposed mineral soil. And then also there's tree removal and shade alteration. And lastly, the picture on the bottom right is a sinkhole also. You can't really tell because it's covered with wind throw. But, and this is an example of a sinkhole with for sure a lot of wind throw disturbance. And also there would be shade alteration and possibly slash, introduction of slash. And all the data that we collect on these features are entered digitally into an iPad, and then we can easily roll up the results later. Okay, so now how are the results used? So once we've completed data collection on the sample of features within the Karst sample area, a summary of results is provided on the digital app on our iPads. And these observations are summarized into tables, and we also get some pie charts presented to help highlight results. This is purely a descriptive type of summary, but it does help us because, for example, we are interested to know what kinds of disturbances we're seeing on the features in the harvest area versus those in the retention area. That's an example of some of the information we want to know. So we know that features in the harvest area obviously will have tree removal and shade alteration, but we're interested to know, like, were they otherwise protected? For example, we would hope to see no skidding disturbance, no forest floor disturbance, no introduced slash. So in the top right pie chart, it's just an example, but we can see that 60% of the features sampled in the harvest area only had tree removal and shade alteration, while 40% had additional disturbances. So this is good information for us, and we can dig into that a bit more with the data. The bottom pie chart shows us that 60% of the features within the retention areas, and this is based on the sample, were shown to be undisturbed, but still 20% had wind throw and 20% had shade alteration. So this is the kind of data that is very useful for reflecting back on the efficacy of the forest practices in protecting karst. So at this stage, we just have a description or a summary of results. We can now use this summary to help answer a series of closing questions. We have a number of closing questions that are answered based on review of the data summary and from other observations made throughout our walkthrough or recce of the karst sample area. So I'll just read a few of the examples that are in that table. Were all caves adequately identified and mapped prior to the FREP karst evaluation? Were tree removal and shade alteration the only disturbance types for surface karst features sampled in the harvest area, i.e., did they take care not to skid across and introduce slash? Third, did all surface karst features in retention areas avoid disturbance, i.e., did they manage for wind throw appropriately? Did the harvesting activities avoid higher vulnerability karst areas of the KSA? Did the roads, quarries, and landings avoid higher vulnerability karst areas of the KSA? So looking at the top pie chart again, the one at the top right, and then looking at the second question, were tree removal and shade alteration the only disturbance types for surface karst features sampled in the harvest area? looking at the pie chart, we would say no. We've also seen other disturbances in addition to those. And then we can dig into that and see, well, was that road materials being directed and introduced into the feature? Was there disturbed mineral soil? And so that these closing questions will help us in making recommendations for improvements to harvesting activities, road construction, pre-harvest assessments, things like that. In this case, we could say, perhaps we could recommend that machine-free zones be implemented around the features in the harvest area. So third bullet, once a KSA has been sampled, we want to derive a score or rating. And this is to describe how well the government objective to protect karst has been met. But this rating system is currently in development. It will be based on the results of the evaluation and will provide an estimate of how likely the forest practices will maintain or protect the surface karst features. And this is essentially to answer the original karst evaluation question that I showed on a slide prior. Are current forest practices protecting and conserving surface karst features and higher vulnerability karst terrain? So one of the rating systems we're looking at will factor in the magnitude or degree of the type of disturbance that's been recorded at each feature. The rating score could also factor in vulnerability of the site. And so this rating system would be based on the premise that avoidance of disturbance to features means there's a greater likelihood of protecting and conserving the surface karst features and higher vulnerability terrain. So a final rating will be generated and it will be expressed as a likelihood. How likely is it that the forest practice protects and conserves surface karst features and higher vulnerability terrain? And it's important to have a final rating or score. It helps define flags for when we need to signal a need for practice improvements. It helps us communicate results to licensees. And having a structured rating system will make the scoring consistent and repeatable across different people who do the assessment. This will minimize the risk of having different interpretations and will avoid criticisms of subjectivity. So these FREP evaluations, going back to the original purpose of FREP, one of the original purposes, they're used to help meet FREP's purpose of identifying opportunities for continued improvement of practices and to bring about change to policies and legislation. Okay, and that's it for me. I'm wondering, does anyone have questions for me or Hannah on any of the foregoing?
And I just wanted to point out this photo. I showed a photo earlier of Chris standing above a karst feature, and this is the photo Chris took looking back.
Yeah. So this is, so this is me, and then the other side of this very large sinkhole with a cave at the bottom looks like this.
Yeah. There are a couple of questions in the chat box. How do you want to do this, Jerry and Ray?
If somebody wants to raise their hand, and if I see them.
There's a question, what is epikarst exposure?
Okay, so that I can answer that. That is one of the surface karst features that we evaluate under the FREP evaluation, and it is essentially any exposed calcareous rock that would have been exposed by removal of soil or organic.
Okay, Stuart Taylor.
Thank you for your time on taking your evening to come out and talk to all of us. I think we all really appreciate this. It's a great insight into what's going on in government and the interactions with karst and forestry. A couple times, when you're talking about road building, does it fall under the same regulations? And like, if there is karst there, it has to be observed in the same way as a forestry operation? Or is it observed in a different way? It seemed like there was something to read between some lines there on a couple comments. And in my personal experience, you can look at significant karst features and see sometimes roads are awkwardly close to them.
Good question.
Yeah, so road building is considered a forest practice. So it is fair game to be, it's subject to the same legislation that Hannah was describing. It's it's definitely, there's a lot of best management practices around road building in the Karst Management Handbook that we expect folks to follow. And in a karst evaluation, I showed an example of a cut block with a karst sample area, but you could have a karst sample area that straddled an access road. And if there were surface features identified around the road, whether the road was, the orientation was changed to accommodate. And so anyway, yes, fair game to evaluate around a road. The cut block would just be the starting point for randomly selecting, but we could absolutely evaluate around the road. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that evaluation would come back to a registered forester to provide to a forestry licensee. Is that correct? Or I don't know if the wording's right there, but.
Well, the evaluation would be conducted by the district staff of the Ministry of Forests and Lands. They may not be registered professional foresters, but they're definitely trained. And we do a training process to make sure everyone's doing the data collection the same way. Then the app rolls up the results, and that can be used to convey the results back to the licensee.
And in our
you.
experience, licensees have typically really well received, not just the karst evaluations, but other evaluations as an opportunity to see where things aren't quite going the way they should, and opportunities to improve, or to see where they're going very well. So that's part of the FREP program, is to ensure that licensees have an opportunity to see that data and get that feedback.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's great.
Jason, you had your hand up. Do you still have a question? Oh. Jason's gone.
There was also a question in the chat, and
Yes.
I can just read it out. And so I think it's a two-part question. So it goes like this. So are there specific plant and animal species that prefer the karst habitat? For those of us who know nothing about karst, I am wondering why karst are highlighted. Why are they a highlighted feature? What makes them special to those of you who specialized in karst management? And why should the public know or care about karsts?
What a great question. What a great opportunity to talk about, to expound on how important karst is. And I'd welcome any of the other people, Paul, David, Charlene, to just kind of talk about what it is that makes karst so special. Chris, if you wanted to answer that.
Well, I got the first question. Sorry, I was writing some notes down. Are specific plants and animals?
I can reiterate.
Okay.
So I'll just go one question and then let you address the next one. So are there specific plant and animal species that prefer the karst habitat?
Yes, absolutely. And
then it's, so why are they, and I guess to get some, I guess maybe I'm not sure how the second part here fits into that. I guess this is a second question. So that's one question kind of phrased this too. So I guess just to start with that, what are there specific plant and animal species that prefer the karst habitat?
Yeah, there are, and there are mammals such as bats, there's arthropods, there's plants. We have a listing of those in our karst evaluation protocol document. So we are supposed to note them in an evaluation if you see them. I personally have not seen any, and I don't know if it's just the time of year, and maybe a lot of these are cave dwelling. But some of the plants are those that need a calcium-rich or nutrient-rich environment. So that would be my answer to the first one. Yes, there are, and we do record them during the FREP evaluation.
Yeah, I have a kind of question that's kind of builds off that, I guess, and it kind of relates to you, because it's not something I specialize in whatsoever, but just recently have been reading more about this, and I'm wondering, so there's this idea that so karsts, they support a large amount of diversity in the range of species owing to the complex topography of karst systems. And that in doing so, as a result of this complexity, you have a lot of different micro habitats that you create niches for different organisms to specialize in. And so, but I'm wondering, is it true that overall there is a greater number of species per kind of, let's say, per land unit in a karst landscape compared to, just a general forest? Is that, or is it more about, because you can differentiate between biodiversity, and my understanding is that there's two different types to take into consideration. So I'm wondering, in what respect would we consider karst important for biodiversity?
I'm going to ask Paul Griffiths to answer that, because Paul, I remember reading about that in your thesis, so maybe you could help answer that. Not to put you on the spot.
I'll try. You were doing pretty well there, Chris. Well, first of all, like the karst system as a whole, or the karst ecosystem, is rather unique compared to other landscape systems in that it has an extensive subterranean realm, right? So there can be unique or unusual plants associated with both the surface and the subsurface realm. Well, to the limits of photosynthesis underground anyways. But just looking at the animal kingdom underground, it would also be true to say, I believe, that the biomass underground is an order of magnitude less than it is on the surface. Nevertheless, the biodiversity of subterranean organisms can be high. The numbers could be low, but the diversity high. So what value does one place on that? And all one can say is that most speleobiologists, I guess you could call them that, value the subsurface realm in karst landscape systems because they tend to produce unique and unusual species adapted to the underground, the absence of light, high humidity, lower temperatures, maybe fewer predators. So it depends on what your measurement is, right? How do you value biodiversity if the total population is low? I guess it was yesterday I was reading a paper on the impact of wildfires on lava caves. Slightly different, right? But that's another type of subterranean realm. But the results revealed that the biodiversity was even greater post-fire. But it was because opportunistic organisms were able to use the nutrients that were introduced to the subsurface realm in the lava tube systems that were washed possibly with rainfall post-fire. And so the biodiversity in the subterranean realm was even higher in that case. But unfortunately, it extirpated other species that couldn't survive because of the more opportunistic species.
Yeah, thank you, Paul, for taking that question. That's insightful. Many thanks.
Okay.
Was there a third question or was that answered?
Maybe I'll get Christine herself if she wants to pipe up, and maybe because she can make her question clearer. But there was a third
Okay.
part.
Yeah, it was more, thanks guys. This has just been awesome, I have to say. I didn't know about karsts until I saw this posting for this webinar and I was like, damn, that's a huge gap on my part. I gotta go check this out. So thank you for bringing it to the normal people, the regular people. And it's more, as I'm reading it, and then I just Googled, web searched karsts, and I found Paul's name in there, a 2017 article, which actually details the ecological significance of karsts. But it's also, so I'm a general member of the general public. So, but why haven't we heard about karsts? And so what can we do to make sure people understand that karsts are important? What makes them special? And you know, we always need a storyline to get the humans to pay attention and to actually vote for protection or what have you, right? So it's like,
Yep.
I guess it was just what makes these so special, you know, these holes in the ground, right? And it isn't that simple, but that's where I went. This was awesome. Thanks, guys.
Cheers, Christine.
Raymond, I see that there's more questions in the chat that keep popping up. I don't know if you want to read those out or those people want to jump in and read their question.
I'm going to encourage people to raise your hand and pipe up and, have the courage to speak up. There's no such thing as a stupid question.
I can't seem to find the chat, so please.
I'm interested in hearing a response on the TVOL asked Trevor.
Oh, that's me. And I don't know how to put my hand up. It's my first time on Zoom.
Okay, well, yeah, just pipe
Go
up.
ahead.
Yeah.
Sure.
So there's lots of cave and karst resources in the interior, including Canada's deepest cave and all that sort of thing. But why are there no karst orders in the interior? And in the absence of karst orders, are you doing any FREP evaluations for karst in the interior of the province?
Good question.
Maybe I can answer the second part and Paul Griffiths could answer the first part. So are we doing FREP evaluations in the interior? No. We might, out of interest and maybe to just get some information, but it wouldn't form part of the data we're collecting on karst practices because, again, we're trying to keep this to being one of the FERPA values, which are those identified as a karst GAR under a karst GAR order. So if there isn't a karst GAR order, then FREP, it's kind of out of our jurisdiction, say. But Paul, maybe you could answer why there aren't any karst GAR orders in the interior of British Columbia. There's some geological and maybe some administrative reasons.
Well, I hope I'm not speaking out of school here, but I do know that the Fort St. James Natural Resource District now contemplated a GAR order. The district out of Nelson at one time contemplated a GAR order. I'm sorry, I don't know the proper names currently for those districts. There is one coastal district that doesn't have a GAR order. It's the only one with karst, and it is, the name escapes me now, the current name, but it used to be the North Coast District, something like that.
Yeah, the Coast Mountains now.
Yeah, they also contemplated an order at one time. The Skeena region, I don't know whether that's still the name, the regional name, they contemplated an order across the region, but decided, again, I can't speak for them, but this is what I was told. They believed that they could accommodate karst within wildlife habitat areas. I didn't necessarily agree, but but that was the rationale for not pursuing an order, a GAR order specific for karst as a matter of priority. So, and then a short answer to the question is, in each case, those interior districts, I think it was a matter of the district manager, who is the one who would issue an order after going through all the hoops in legislation to do one, would have to consider it a priority. So in fairness to them, they may not have encountered many karst issues. They would probably consult licensees, and depending on what the licensee feedback would be, that would factor into where they would rank the priority of doing a karst GAR order.
Can I add too that it gets back, Christine, to your comment on why would the public care? There's lots of good reasons to care about karst. If it's not on the public's radar, it's harder to get it on the radar of the district manager, because they are responding in these designations, et cetera, to what people want to see on the land. So it's a nice plug for the work on the International Year of Caves and Karst and getting the information out there. And there's actually, Chris, I'm wondering if we could share a link to that very cool pamphlet that it's a few years old now, but it really talks about the value of karst. There's some excellent pictures, including the archaeological value, and maybe we could share it with maybe Jerry or Charlene, and we could get it out for people.
Sure, if somebody sends me something,
Yeah,
I'll send it.
if it's specific to BC, that would be cool. I mean, the IYCK pamphlet itself is actually very effective at doing that. And I really appreciated the question from Christine in terms of as just being a member of the general public, well, and not having encountered the topic before. So thanks, Christine Calahoo, if I've got the pronunciation on that correct. I want to say we've got, Paul, my understanding is you've got a few slides. I understand people are eager to ask questions, but my understanding is, Paul, you had a few slides to present as well.
Yes, I thought I'd illustrate what I was going to say about the proclamation, the Caves and Karst.
Yeah, I was wondering if we can if we could have Paul, just out of respect for the speakers' times, just to have them present first, and then we can have all questions addressed afterward. And so I'll hand it over to Paul to let you go forward and with your portion of the talk.
Okay, I see I can share my screen here, but may I ask the moderator, should I start my video or keep it shut down?
Oh,
Please feel free to turn your video on, Paul.
Okay, I'll turn it on here. And just so you can see me for whatever it's worth. And
we like to see you, Paul.
yeah, I don't know about that. Let's see here. Okay, I'll go to full screen. Yeah, I thought I'd, rather than just dryly talk about the thing, give you a sense of the procedure involved, or the origin of this proclamation, because it didn't start out as a request for a proclamation to the BC Proclamations Office. So this is a bit of a timeline and a bit of the process that was followed. The overall process from the time I wrote a letter to the Premier suggesting that he simply consider writing an open letter to the public of BC to recognize the International Year of Caves and Karst. He didn't answer the letter directly. I guess it was, geez, how many years ago now? 34 years ago, that some of us on this Zoom call might remember. I did a similar thing by writing a letter to the Premier of the day, Premier Clark, asking him to write an open letter recognizing the importance of caves and karst on the occasion of the US-Canada symposium dedicated to forest karst ecosystems of all things. And Premier Clark generously wrote a letter, which the organizers of the symposium used to include in the program booklet or the guidebook for the event, which was well attended. So that was 1997. That premier was a member of the same governing party as today. So I thought, well, why don't I write a letter to the current premier, harking back to that letter of decades ago, and ask the current premier just simply to consider writing an open letter to the public recognizing the year. About 2 weeks later, I was notified that a request was made following that letter to the BC Proclamations Office, and they contacted me and said, we'd like to pursue a proclamation. I didn't really know what the process was. I didn't even know there was a proclamations office. But I said, sounds like a good idea. When I wrote the letter to the premier, I took the extra step of copying one of his ministers, cabinet ministers, Nicholas Simons. I'll get to Nicholas in a second, but I thought, well, just rather than leave it to chance that the premier receives the letter, I'll copy others on the letter, including George Venny, the president of the union, the International Union of Speleology. He works in the US. And I also copied the NDP caucus because I knew that they had a policy of supporting, well, at least caves. At one time or another, they had a formal announcement to that effect. I think it's still posted on their website. So I thought, well, they would be a natural to copy. By May 13th, the first version, modeled on elements of my letter, was prepared by the Proclamations Office. And I thought they did a very good job. And they had, I found out later, a procedure of vetting every word, every phrase used in the draft version of the proclamation. Everything from political correctness, I guess, to the veracity of the assertions in the draft clauses of the proclamation. By this time, I found out that in this procedure, a responsible ministry was needed to review and approve the proclamation. Well, that became SDPR there, which stands for the Ministry of Social Development and Poverty Reduction. And that happened to be the ministry of Nicholas Simons. By May 29th, the Attorney General and the Lieutenant Governor reviewed and signed the proclamation. It was posted to the BC Law's website. This all happened very fast. And then it was issued June 6th, formally, under the Great Seal of the province of British Columbia. And there was no media release accompanying it, but that's also the procedure. Go to the next slide here. So just to give a nod to some of the players who would have been involved one way or another in this, well, my letter was targeting the Premier himself, the Honorable John Horgan. And the reason I thought it stood a chance was that the Premier had been involved in efforts to protect a cave that was threatened in the Greater Victoria area. This is a picture of him on the right from 2009. He also supported the two legislative bills for the BC Cave Protection Act, bills M206 and M232, if I remember, in 2010, 2016. While I've got this slide up, I should mention that the fellow to his right is Chief Don Tom of the Sartlip Nation. It's the largest First Nation on southern Vancouver Island. But Chief Tom is now vice president of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. And I only mention that because you'll see in the clauses of the eventual proclamation that there was mention of the ancestral and heritage and cultural value of caves and karst to Indigenous peoples in British Columbia. And I'm sure the Proclamations Office made a point of highlighting this. So quite honestly, I was a little concerned that the proclamation under the Great Seal of British Columbia and under the name of Queen Elizabeth II might be perceived as maybe not a good thing to do. So I took the extra step of contacting Chief Stuart Phillip, the president of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, and copied Chief and Vice President Don Tom, just to make sure that they were aware of the proclamation, because I knew that they, in principle, supported the idea of legislation for caves and karst. And I just want to make sure that they were on board with it. So I just mentioned that as an aside. But really it was Nicholas Simons who probably shepherded the original letter, took it to the Proclamations Office, and then volunteered to become the responsible ministry which the Proclamations Office needed in their process to move the proclamation forward. So Nicholas had been underground in 2009, had also supported the BC Cave Protection Act bills of at least those 2 years. And today he's the Minister of Social Development and Poverty Reduction. Premier Horgan, of course, he's the chair of the Executive Council, but Nicholas also sits on the Executive Council. So that might have been helpful in getting the proclamation to have some legs. Now, you might wonder, well, why was Nicholas, other than having been underground and being exposed to karst and cave issues in the province when he was an MLA before he was minister, his ministry is social development and poverty reduction. But as I've mentioned to another audience, it's ironic that the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of UN Agenda 2030, and Canada is a member of the UN, the first Sustainable Development Goal is number 1, no poverty. And people might wonder, well, how does that relate to karst? I would simply say, ask people in China, including the government, how the health of karst relates to poverty. So there's a bit of a tie there. In doing the proclamation, I told the Proclamations Office that it should reflect the duality of the international year in name, and that is that it just can't be caves, it's got to be karst. In fact, caves are a subset, well, at least karst caves are a subset of karst, which is actually reflected in the commemorative book for the year, where it starts with karst first, then caves, and then people. But the Proclamations Office already knew that. And in crafting the clauses of the proclamation, they reflected that quite faithfully, I would say. Also, they asked me to review the proclamation and its wording, and I thought about it and thought, well, what could relate to it? I knew that, for example, in 1981 in Bowling Green, Kentucky, those of us who were there were party to a resolution calling for the protection of caves, and turned into this 4-clause resolution here. Like if Phil Whitfield is on the Zoom call, I think Phil was there in 1981 in Bowling Green, Kentucky. So it focused on caves, but the international year was about caves and karst. I throw this up because I know participants on this Zoom call are probably members of the BC Speleological Federation. And I think their resolution is in the public domain, so to speak. They took the 1981 resolution of the International Union of Speleology and added karst to it. So when thinking about the proclamation that was being drafted by the Proclamations Office, I sort of looked around to see whether it was consistent with things that were already published on the subject and pertinent to BC. Also considered consistency with the ecosystem approach to managing karst adopted by BC from about 1997 on. And I think it was Hannah that mentioned this publication, which is an 8-page booklet. There's also a companion wall poster for it. And these things are still around, but in those 8 pages, it will explain all of the resource values associated with both caves and karst, or more specifically, karst caves and karst in BC. I think you could find it online as well. To look at some of the wording very briefly, just have to move my gallery over so I can see what I'm displaying here. But in that first clause, I thought it was fairly pertinent that they had included the term landscape, right? So I know there are up to 150 definitions of karst, but consistent with the BC government approach to managing karst, as enunciated in published guidance documents and so on, it's recognized that it is a landscape system. It isn't just the bedrock shell. It includes vegetation, soils, wildlife, energy transfers, water, all the ecosystem components. So by inserting the word landscape in here, I thought that was quite useful of the Proclamations Office to do. And the proclamation also recognizes the importance of habitat associated with karst. And I know there was that previous question, what makes karst special? Why should it be managed, compared to another landscape system? And I think Ray mentioned the heterogeneity of karst, or the topographical complexity, giving characteristics of shade and temperature gradients and so on that might provide specialized habitats for both plants and animals. And then, of course, I think, I mentioned the subterranean realm, so that adds an extensive third dimension. And as some cavers know on this Zoom call, caves can be as deep as 2.2 kilometers. So it's quite it's a recognized dimension of karst that doesn't necessarily exist in another rock type. So important for biology. And a couple things I've underlined here in this clause, and that is the term terrain in the first line, right? So there's recognition that it's not just discrete karst features that might have some significance or drive management, but it may be the karst terrain as a whole, right? So it's interesting to note that while 5 out of the 6 GAR orders recognize important features or elements of high and very high vulnerability karst terrain. One district, Haida Gwaii Natural Resource District, identifies simply high and very high vulnerability karst terrain for protection as a resource feature. So I thought it was significant that the Proclamations Office included the word terrain in this clause, as well as in the second line, there was emphatic recognition of the value of these resources to Indigenous communities in BC. You know, it's variable across the province. It's variable by feature, by terrain, of course. And finally, I think in getting to the end here, but why the date, June 6th? Well, that's something that was proposed by the Proclamations Office. To their credit, they did extensive research on the proclamation as a whole and the wording, and kind of bounced it back and forth. There were very minor changes to the final version that was eventually approved by the responsible ministry, Nicholas Simon's ministry. But they also found out, primarily through the internet, that June the 6th was recognized in some quarters for caves and in some instances karst as well. So they proposed automatically June the 6th. And they asked me, what did I think about it? You must remember there wasn't very much time, because it takes 4 weeks from the time the proclamation final version is reviewed and approved by the responsible ministry. It takes 4 weeks to schedule it to be issued. So it was coming on to summer. And I thought, well, I don't know very much about what June the 6th means right now in terms of a recognized Caves and Karst Day. So I'll ask George Benny in the US to tell me if there's anything we should know before we go ahead and say, yeah, June the 6th. Like personally, I thought, you know, if it's in the summer, it might not be ideal. School's out. If it's in the fall and winter, it's maybe not ideal. And they had the opportunity to put it on the roster and get it done on June the 6th. So I said, well, from my standpoint, I have no issue with it. So why June the 6th? Well, in their research, they found that the International Show Caves Association had recognized June the 6th, which was upcoming, 2021, as the International Day of Caves and the Subterranean World. So that didn't fit exactly, right? Because the subterranean realm with respect to karst is one thing, but there are subterranean realms in other landscapes as well, perhaps not as deep, but it was just a little bit off the mark. Also, beginning in 2017, the National Caves Association in the US had declared June the 6th as National Caves and Karst Day. So that's what the Proclamations Office had stumbled upon and lent support to why they were proposing June the 6th. Now, a few odds and ends to do with, I suppose you could call it the fallout of the proclamation, that were in some cases rather unexpected. I couldn't possibly throw up the emails that I received in the 24 hours following the proclamation, but from the most unusual quarters. Like some of them, of course, I don't feel would be proper to flip on the screen, because they were private emails, but they came from all levels of government and industry, and fairly high levels. You know, people in executive positions would say, this is great. We'll raise a beer to this. In this particular case, it was published online, so I feel it's okay to display it. But it was Mosaic Forests, who are one of the largest licensees and private forest landowners, at least on Vancouver Island. And they issued this tweet, which I thought was interesting because it recognized the activity of managing karst and recognizing their staff or perhaps their contractors who do this work for them. So I thought that was rather unique. And I thought, well, if the proclamation motivated that kind of response within industry itself, that's probably a good thing. There are toddlers at a daycare that were fondling limestone that sent me an email with a picture to show, oh, look, we recognize the day, or we showed the children limestone. I think this is my last slide, but Dr. Charles Helm in Tumbler Ridge, he communicated with me and told me we decided to celebrate the day by having a cleanup crew remove wind-thrown trees along the Stone Corral Karst Interpretive Trail. So a number of people were motivated to do something. I know that many in the speleological community were already doing events to recognize the International Year, and possibly even the declaration of BC Caves and Karst Day, which the proclamation was for. And incidentally, the reason it was revolving around a day was because it was the policy of the Proclamations Office that they no longer recognized international years. It was just their policy, but they could designate a day and recognize that day. And it's not automatically recurring, but anyone, any individual or organization can request that the proclamation be renewed the following year and subsequent years. So that's possible to do. And yes, I think that's my last slide there.
Thank
Thanks.
you, Paul. And for as long as our guests still have time and are available, I'd say I'll welcome again questions, and I think you can direct them at either Christine and Paul and our other speaker. Sorry, name is Hannah, right?
Hannah. Yes.
Hannah. So yeah, so I think Jason, right, has had a burning question. So Jason, please go ahead.
Thank you, Ray. And I just want to say thank you to Chris and Hannah, and to, of course, to Dr. Griffiths. My question is for Dr. Griffiths. How important do you see organized caving to be towards future cave and karst protection? And if so, how can we best support that activity or movement?
I'll just turn on the video here again. Oh, I think it's key, particularly with respect to caves. Now, of course, karst is related to karst caves. So to the extent that adequately protecting and managing karst linked to caves would be an automatic imperative for any speleological community.
Okay, that's great. And I was just thinking, like Chris Lohr was talking about the FREP and the rating system or the evaluation, and saying it's not subjective. Could you speak towards that? I mean, I know I look at some things and they look important to me, but you know, the RFP might say not so much. How does the government or this how do you guys plan on dealing with the subjective aspect of cave and karst protection or assessment? Thank you.
Well, so the rating system that we are proposing, well, a few of the rating system, we have 2 rating systems we're proposing to be used after a FREP karst evaluation. And I think subjectivity will be minimized because it's going to be based on the data collected. So how much wind throw was there? What kind of feature was it? Was it a feature complex? What is the karst vulnerability of the area as per KISFAP, the karst inventory standards? So it's kind of a formula that and a structured process that wouldn't be subjective. But having said that, a lot of the structure and the formulas that we're proposing to build into that, those could change as we gain more knowledge from research about things, about thresholds, about how different impacts and different disturbances can cause. Like, are some types of impacts or disturbances have greater impacts? Is burning and introducing road materials into a sinkhole more damaging than, say, shade alteration? I don't know. And how much wind throw crosses a threshold that becomes more damaging? So those thresholds might be tweaked over time, but yeah, if the data is collected objectively, the resulting risk rating should be the same for no matter who does the evaluation. That's the goal anyway.
Thank you, Chris.
Okay.
Kind of the holy grail, I would say.
So folks, if you want, feel free to put your cameras back on. Of course, we're not going to compel you to do so because now that the talks are done. We've got another question here in the lineup from Phil Whitfield. Phil, go ahead.
Thanks. First of all, thanks very much to Hannah and Chris and Paul. It's been a very interesting evening. And I don't want to put the Flinrod folks on the spot too much, but one question I have is back in 2014, the Federation filed a fairly formal complaint about some logging practices on Vancouver Island, including sinkholes jammed with debris and this sort of thing. We got back a letter from compliance and enforcement saying that, oh, we are very busy, we have an awful lot of things to do, covering a big ground, we can't really deal with it. Thanks very much. And so my question is, you're doing a good job, I think, by setting up a monitoring system, and you're working toward improving policy, which is, come a long way since the 90s or the early 2000s. But do you know of any cases that have actually been prosecuted by compliance and enforcement for any violations of karst gar orders? Or if not, are we looking at lots of carrots but no sticks?
I'll just make a comment. Sorry, Phil?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a good comment. And the whole thing about regulation around this kind of management is it has to be enforceable. And one of the challenges is if it's not, for example, if it's difficult to unequivocally demonstrate damage, and I know that Paul has opinions on this too, but if that's a hard thing to do or render ineffective in a way that results in a conviction, that makes it very difficult sometimes to actually enforce. And I know the Forest Practices Board produced a report. So the way it works is that you can make a complaint to the Compliance Enforcement Branch around practices that are not meeting what you think is the standard or the regulation. And you also have an alternative to talk to the Forest Practices Board, who have the who if it meets their criteria, can initiate an investigation as well. And so they did a report, and they had some recommendations. In fact, it was in the chat, somebody quoted from the Forest Practices Board about some things that the board said that the province needs to do, but they ruled not that the activity was not damage to the karst, and I understand that was a fairly controversial kind of decision on their part. So things like damage, which are quite subjective, can be problematic, and that may be, I don't know why, I don't engage with compliance and enforcement on this stuff, but I can imagine that that's one of the challenges around actually making these things happen.
Well, the other element here is that there is no sort of benchmark established before harvesting occurs that can be measured afterwards. It isn't as though every sinkhole gets a photograph or anything.
Yes.
I'd really like to hear Paul's perspective on this, so I'll shut up.
Yeah.
Actually, I'll just cut in really quick too. It's Dave. I think, Phil, what you're highlighting as far as the photographing or, documenting karst, I think that's one of the reasons why it's really important to make sure we have people that are qualified karst assessors who are,
Yep.
Following those standards and applying that. Because, really any karst assessment should have a photograph and measurements and good documentation of each and every feature. But you're absolutely right. I see reports lots of times that don't include that. And I actually, I also understand, Hannah, your point there as well about, having to be enforceable and everything else. And I know that is the big debate, but a little information on the case Bill was referring to, it actually involved a cave entrance that had a stump put into it after there was a request made to leave a reserve on the feature. So the cave had no reserve on it, and a large root wad stump was jammed into the entrance of the cave, making it, not accessible by anyone anymore. So if there ever a case that should have resulted in easily to prove damage, that probably was it. But I do understand as well, that's not, your department, and, you're working with what you got.
Wow, that sounds like a much more straightforward decision on compliance, but yeah.
Paul, you wanted to?
Yeah. Ray, yes. I just want in reply to Phil, because you asked Phil about prosecutions. The regulation that comes into play is the Forest Planning and Practices Regulation, subsection, or rather section 70, subsection 1. Like a person carrying out an authorized primary forest activity cannot damage or render ineffective, those aren't the exact words, a resource feature, meaning a resource feature identified for protection through a karst GAR order, specifically in this case. I found one case, but I guess technically it's a form of prosecution, but it was a violation ticket. But it was specific to section 70, subsection 1, and it involved a karst system element. I obtained a copy of the ticket through the Freedom of Information and Privacy Act process, so I'm free to talk about it, I guess. But it involved disturbance to the ground near a cave, and the offense was no damage to the cave was shown. It was based on the probability that there could be damage to the cave, even though the cave was about 80 meters away, right? It might have been linked to the cave in some manner. And Chris and I were talking about this the other day, but if you read the definition of a cave in the Karst Management Handbook and in KISFAP, the Karst Inventory Standards and Vulnerability Assessment Procedures, it defines caves to include any extensions or possible extensions to the surface, even though they may not be passable by people, right? So it could include a sinkhole, a crevice, a grike, an enlarged fissure, something like that. So I think the district involved was thinking along those lines, that the ground disturbance, which involved just a few square meters over here, 80 meters away, could jeopardize the cave over here. And it was on that basis that a violation ticket was made, and it wasn't challenged, and the fine was paid. It was a minimal fine. The other thing is, on the issue of damage, there is in some ways legal precedence in that there was the case on Haida Gwaii involving damage to karst. There were a couple examples of it. One involved cutting a road through epikarst, and another one involved disrupting a sinking watercourse, a smaller stream, a non-classified drainage that was sinking into the ground. And the fine imposed was $45,000. It was the maximum penalty allowed, but it was under the Forest Practices Code legislation. But it was adjudicated in the FERPA era, the era of the current Forest and Range Practices Act. Under that, in that era, but under the former legislation. But the facts of the case involving, could the compliance officer, who didn't know all that much about karst, could he conclude that karst was damaged? And I guess he did. And so the fine, however, was overturned, but it was overturned on a technicality. The papers were served on the individual instead of the company, or the other way around. So the fine was overturned on appeal to the Forest Appeals Commission. In a related, slightly related matter, but not involving karst per se, there's the precedent of Rustad Brothers versus the Crown. And that was another Forest Appeals Commission thing where, ironically, it was the Forest Practices Board that was a third-party appellant to the case that argued it doesn't matter how ongoing damage is, how extensive it is, that things can repair themselves. Damage is damage. And when damage is in the legislation and not further qualified in the language of the legislation, it was the Appeals Commission finding that a message should still be sent to the person who, in that case, damaged trees, right? And no matter how minimal the damage was, the finding was not overturned, and a contravention was still upheld, and a penalty was imposed, but the Appeals Commission said, yeah, we recognize it's almost trivial damage, and the scarring of the trees, in fact, will heal over, and there's no loss, there's no monetary loss to the Crown in terms of timber because of the scarring of the trees. The bark will heal over the scars, no problem. So we will reflect that in the penalty. Like, in other words, they have the administrative discretion to impose a small penalty as opposed to a big penalty. So there's that. That was an interesting ruling on the meaning of damage. And of course, in the forest planning and practices regulation, section 70, it's like, in plain language, it's do not damage or render ineffective. So it's not do not damage and render ineffective, it's or. So environmental lawyers who have looked at this and rendered opinions on it, actually the reason they rendered opinions on it, it was because of disputes over the findings of damage in the Forest Practices Board report of 2014 for Northern Vancouver Island. But they ruled that the language is simple And that reflects the intent of the legislatures not to restrict the meaning of damage too narrowly. And they pointed to the other example in legislation, which is, I think it's section 46, something like that. It escapes me now, but it defines damage to the environment. Well, damage to the environment is a different part of the legislation. And there they restrict the meaning of damage to fairly narrow descriptive lists of what damage to the environment means, right? You just can't simply cause damage to soil. It's got to be a specific type of damage to soil and extent of the damage. There were parameters put on it. Whereas damage to a karst resource feature, the environmental lawyers argued in the opinions, the written opinions that I saw, suggested that no, it was kept fairly straightforward, not to constrain it. And furthermore, they pointed to the rationale documents that some of the district managers used to support their GAR orders, where they refer to the provincial published guidance documents and say to licensees that reflects our intent of the orders, right? So for example, if an order says it identifies significant surface karst features and the regulation says not to damage or render them ineffective, the district manager said, well, I can't explain that. I don't want to confine it to very narrow terms within the legislation. But in my rationale document, I can refer to extra legal documentation. And in this case, he or she referred to the Karst Management Handbook, right? So when you look at the Karst Management Handbook and the recommended minimum best practices for significant surface karst features, they're all founded on the principle of surrounding them with no harvest buffers or reserves of recommended minimum widths. So the intent, the environmental lawyers would suggest, was clearly to maintain the integrity of the feature that these buffers surround. And in no instance should they be logged, right? So I mentioned that.
Looks like Hannah has a point to add.
Not so much. Oh, sorry, trying to lower my hand. Not so much a point. I do want to acknowledge Paul's extraordinary wealth of knowledge about historically and current about karst management. I just want to say thank you, everybody. I do have to go. I have family things I have to deal with.
Yes.
And I'm very, very grateful for the invitation and all the best.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for taking the time to speak with us this evening.
Cheers. Bye,
Thank you,
everybody.
Hannah.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hannah.
May I say one more thing, Ray?
Sure. Yeah, sure.
Sorry. I don't know that it's so much in reply to Phil's comments. It might be Dave's or both. But the idea that if you don't have a record of baseline conditions, then that poses a problem for compliance. I think both spoke to that, right? And on that note, again, the legal opinions I've seen in writing suggest that that is not always the case. And in fact, photographic evidence is not needed. For example, if you have a significant surface karst feature and it was treed and the trees are being cut, a court can rely upon expert testimony to say, yes, these tree stumps exhibit mechanical saw cuts of this age bracket. It can be linked to the harvesting that was perhaps under permit there. And furthermore, they point to court precedents in other cases where it was not necessary to know the condition of the feature beforehand through photographic documentation. It sufficed to have suitable expert testimony testify to the damage in many cases. It would probably be useful if that report of legal opinions could be shared, but it's a little complicated because the legal opinions were offered on a privileged client solicitor basis because of disputes with the Forest Practices Board. Let's put it that way.
I do want to add that the issue of damage has and continues to be like a point of disconnect for us between what our guidance says, our interpretations about the condition of karst and forest licensees, and even with the Forest Practices Board, despite the simplicity of the concept as Paul was describing. So I think it is, going forward, I think there could be some value in providing some interpretation, not an amendment to the legislation, but interpretation on what damage means in this case. Whether that be in like a some kind of forest facts bulletin or something like that. We've talked about that, Paul. That could be helpful.
Well, an example would be material adverse damage. That description was the subject of an interpretation bulletin put out by the ministry.
Oh, okay.
Right, for another section of the legislation. But that would be an example where, they went a step further to do that, yeah.
Paul, you talked about altering perspective. Is that considered a form of damage? I mean, would that be considered a form of damage?
I guess I could try to answer that indirectly because I dealt with it, just yesterday. It's because the Campbell River Natural Resource District, it did a karst gar order in 2007, I think, 2007. But the preceding year, they had done a recreation resource feature order, also under GAR, the Government Actions Regulation. And it might interest people on the call to know that many of the recreation resource features that were designated that way through that order were cave and karst sites. And some people on this call would know what those sites are, and some of them amount to hundreds of hectares each. It was fairly ambitious of the district to have done that in 2006. But if you look at the next district up and what they had going in about the same period, they had no such order. But the Campbell River district had many sites designated that way. Now, the thing is, when designated as a recreation resource feature, then the feature, in many cases, there were big sites, like let's say 50 hectares. The whole of the feature is then subject to the same section of the Forest Planning and Practices Regulation, Section 70. Do not damage or render ineffective. That's the starting point anyways. Well, the district manager at the time also wrote a rationale document to support his order, the recreation resource features order. And in that rationale document, which runs into multiple pages and is designed to help support the order and explain it to licensees and other stakeholders, etc. He said, when it comes to contemplating damage to one of the features I've designated this way, I will contemplate impacts to visual quality and sense of place, aesthetics, that sort of thing. And I thought that was kind of interesting. Now, it was not a karst GAR order that came the next year, but subject to the same regulation. And it gave a sense of the thinking that went on in his head about what damage could be other than purely biophysical damage. And I thought, like, I wouldn't go as far as saying, oh, you could transfer that as an example of damage to a pure karst GAR order feature. But that I mentioned that by way of background.
Oh, thank you, Paul. So I think we're losing some of our audience's attention, and it might be a good time to wrap up. I think IYCK might be having a club discussion, but I know I myself personally have to go at this point. And so to end, I just want to say once again, thank you very much to our speakers. So Christine Lohr and Dr. Paul Griffiths, we really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to speak with us tonight. And I just want to make a note for those still here that we have upcoming 2 other events, which we'll release the details of. So later in November, so later this month, we have, oh, that is the wrong document. Here it is. So on November 24th at 6 p.m., we have Dr. Corey Lawson giving a talk on the state of bats in Canada and with respect to white nose syndrome. And then later in December, we'll have a bit of a unique event by a good friend of mine, Carol. She'll be presenting her poetry on caves. So stay tuned for further details on those events. And we hope to have you there. So once again, thanks to everyone for coming out tonight. And we'll talk to you later.
Ray.
Yep.
Ray,
For having us.
Could you send me the date preferred for the poetry one?
Yeah, December 19th.
December 19th? Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you to our guests.
Thanks.
Yeah,
And
Chris and Paul, thank you so much. This was a really amazing night. Thank you.
Okay. Bye all.
Thank you all for listening. Bye.
Oh, it was great.
yeah, well, now there's silence. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Christine.
Yeah, you're welcome, Jerry.
And it was good to see you again.
Yep. We'll see you later.
Yeah. Yeah. Take it
Bye.
easy.
Thanks,
Take
Paul.
care.
Bye.
Once you hit unrecording, then we'll speak again.
Oh, you want me to hit unrecording? Okay.